Hello and welcome to the Progression Podcast. In this podcast, we talk about large societal issues on the world. Today, we're going to be talking about global citizenship and how it affects systemic inequity in society. I believe that global citizenship is the way to dismantle systemic inequity in society. In particular, for this podcast, I will focus on how global citizenship affects racism and privilege in society. Levy is speaking about how racism has become ingrained into society throughout many years. This causes white people to believe that there are no systemic problems facing BIPOC people because it becomes ingrained into society over time, not realizing that the privilege to say that comes from their skin color as they don't experience systemic racism. The problems generated from systemic racism don't just disappear because racism is illegal. Redlining is a great example of how systemic inequity ends up affecting multiple generations as the wealth of the land affects the wealth of the people inside of them. Levy is speaking about how racism has become ingrained into society throughout many years. This causes white people to believe that there are no systemic problems facing BIPOC people because it becomes ingrained into society over time, not realizing that the privilege to say that comes from their skin color as they don't experience systemic racism. The problems generated from systemic racism don't just disappear because racism is illegal. Redlining is a great example of how systemic inequity ends up affecting multiple generations as the wealth of the land affects the wealth of the people inside of them. Another example is the grandfather law, which prohibited black people from voting because their grandparents could not vote, even though it specifically did not disallow black people from voting. Avoidance doesn't help the problem in this case either. To incorporate global citizenship into this issue, we must teach how dismissal and denial of key issues experienced by oppressed people affect their daily lives and society as a whole. We need to begin stopping jokes that are painted towards our community in a playful light and hold each other accountable for actions and jokes we make that devalue the experiences and struggles of other people. For my next point, privileged people have a hard time understanding and coming to terms with their privilege granted through societal factors. On the Social Change Lab blog, the author Tulsi Achia describes the social impact of privilege on the human psyche. As the quote is quite long, I'll paraphrase it for a little bit. Essentially, she talks about how when a person comes from a socially privileged group, it becomes hard for them to acknowledge these privileges that they are granted. They end up using coping mechanisms like denying the existence of their social privilege or by putting themselves into another less privileged group. They also tend to downplay the prejudices of prejudice, discrimination, and inequality by talking about how these biases and disparities to these people can simply be referred to as some bad apples. When a privileged person is forced to understand their own privilege, they essentially become defensive and arrogant, not because that's who they are as a person, but because the emotional distress of feeling as if success is not granted to someone based solely on their actions, but also because of systemic racism and systemic inequality, they tend to downplay or shun away from the things that make them feel this way. Now, global citizenship can actually help these people by helping them understand that their intersecting identities does make them more privileged, but that it does not invalidate their experiences, nor does it make them less or greater than another person. It may be difficult to process the emotions to start off, but it helps to understand that being a global citizen and acknowledging these intersecting identities is not a personal attack, but rather is to help them dismantle social and societal inequalities brought by millennia of harmful ideologies and stereotypes. Finally, systemic racism deludes people into believing that the struggle for inequality is ending or solved, or that it simply does not exist. An article from the Pew Research Center on the views of race and inequality states that an overwhelming majority of blacks, 88%, say the country needs to continue making changes for blacks to have equal rights with whites. 43% are skeptical that such changes will ever occur. A much lower share of whites, 53%, say the country still has much more work to do for blacks to achieve equal rights with whites, and only 11% express doubt that the changes will ever come. From this evidence and other evidence based in the article, it can essentially be assumed that the majority of white people, especially white Republicans, believe that the struggle for equality is over. It's evidenced by how they talked about prejudice in the article, with multiple people saying that racism is a case-by-case basis and not systemic. They also believe that the family life of a black person has more to do with how they get ahead. White Republicans mostly believe that racism is overblown by society and that we don't need to talk about it that much anymore. And that very few of them believe that race matters at all in society. Harmful because it's essentially painting a view that black people and other BIPOCs essentially do not have any meaning inside of society. Their struggles, their experiences, all of that stuff doesn't actually happen and is simply fake or non-existent. A solution to this problem is by teaching CRT to the vast majority of people. Critical race theory and intersectionality and global citizenship all help to talk about how these problems are experienced by different people in a different way all across the entire world, and how we can help solve this problem by not only learning more about it, by also applying what we learn and by not repeating the mistakes we've produced in the past. Thank you for watching and have a good day.